Okay, welcome back, everyone. We can, I think, start our final panel before the keynote lecture entitled European History, West and East. I'm very happy to, first of all, say thank you to the organizers, Gabor, Livia, and of course to our interpreters who are, I think, doing a very hard job. On our panel, we have 4 panelists. I will try to keep time so that we don't run over into the lunch break. So on my right-hand side, I have Ádám MESTYÁN from the Duke University. After him, Máté RIGÓ from LMU in Munich. And then following him, we have Paul GRADVOHL from Sorbonne Panthéon in Paris, and Hannes GRANDITS from Humboldt University in Berlin, who will be mostly reflecting on the contemporary trends and projects in relation on this kind of more synthetic European history and different, or maybe not so different, approaches to East and West and more broadly symbolic geographies in relation to post-imperial transitions. And just one last thing before I give them floor. It's interesting that we have some, how to say, more or less overt Ottomanists. So I think the East here is a much broader actually category, and we might even be talking about North and South as well. So we will maybe be kind of circling around the title of the panel. So Ádám, the floor is yours. Sorry. Yeah, I just yeah, Máté, the floor is yours. Yeah. Can we get the presentation? Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming. What all 4 of us agreed is that this is the panel before the keynote of Holy Case and also before lunch. So we try to be concise. I'm sorry for those of you who have heard me present many times about my 2022 book, Capitalism in Chaos. So what I'll try to do this time is to summarize some broader conclusions and even questions I have about the period in connection to the book and its Hungarian translation, which is on the right side. I mean, one of the questions that we could talk about is why we are all sitting here. Why is there a conference on post-imperial transitions? What makes this period so flourishing? Why are there so many works on this era that surpassed the centenary of 1913, Europe's Last Summer, which was sort of an overlooked book, even surpassed books on the centenary of the July Crisis or 1914, and even the 70th anniversary of the Second World War, which didn't produce such a big historiographical boom. What makes the post-1918 era so special or different, or what makes it sort of worth investigating? So one of the answers that Capitalism in Chaos gives to this question is looking at the era through local society is something that Gabor mentioned earlier, not so much because historians are in general enamored with actors, enamored with agency, but because this was a very specific era in which local societies just had more agency than in other historical eras. And that also means that the period cannot be flattened or united under a grand narrative in a similar way that, let's say, Sovietization after 1948 or after the Second World War, or the transition to market capitalism or liberal democracies after 1989. So I think one of the interesting things of this era is that it's so diverse geographically, nationally, sub-regionally, or regionally. For a variety of reasons, from a macro level, Adam Tooze's argument that focuses on a power vacuum or the withdrawal of the United States. I try to write about the book how France is trying to sort of fill this void, but is ultimately unable to do that. Gives a lot of agency to local societies. This also means that what this book tries to do is to offer a non-determinist account on the history of the regions that we study, the history of Southeast Europe and East Central Europe. It's not always a periphery. A periphery can sometimes become the central, or have at least a central position. And I'm going through the slides real quick, and then I'm moving on to a slide with some key takeaway points. One of the key issues, I think, for post-imperial transition is the war itself. So let's not forget that the era that we're discussing comes after the First World War, and why that matters. I think the main reason is empire building, at least until 1917, Ukraine and Southeast Europe, that completely changes how these actors of Austria-Hungary and Germany view themselves, and also changes the geopolitical position of East Central and Southeast Europe, and makes it in a way the center of European reconstruction plans. It also creates an economic boom. This is one of the case studies of the book of a tannery in Cluj, Kolozsvár, Transylvania, that experiences a wartime boom, supplying the Austro-Hungarian armies. And after the post-imperial transitions, one of the key paradoxes and questions is, why is it that East Central and Southeast Europe does not become the site of expulsions, genocidal policies. And in the story that this book tells, expulsions happen in Western Europe, in Alsace-Lorraine, where the French put on trains 100,000 Germans in November 1918. And one of the questions that this book investigates, why does it not happen in the case of Transylvania and East Central Europe more broadly speaking? And the answer is not the lack of anti-Semitism. So it doesn't come from ideology, or not the lack of anti-Hungarian or anti-minority sentiment in these regions. Also, I'm playing with sort of placing this region in different contexts. In the case of Alsace, one of the, at least on the level of plans and visions, is the reintegration of this profoundly Central European region, or a region that was integrated in the German Empire in the French colony. You can see sort of a figure representing Indochina and the Strasbourg Cathedral in the background. And looking at businesses in 5 business families and industries and how they weathered this transition, I show that despite border changes, and despite these attempts to integrate Alsace-Lorraine in the French Empire, economically Germany continues to be the main reference point in this case. So moving on to some broader questions and arguments. Alternative geographies of writing European history is important. Not to look at this era of post-imperial transition backward from the perspective of the Cold War, from the perspective of the Iron Curtain, and in a way resurrect the concept of Central Europe, but not the nostalgic one, or not an idealized, romanticized vision of Central Europe, but Mitteleuropa as a core of an imperialist project in which Austro-Hungary and even Hungary had its own positions, and also look at how the role of centers and peripheries changed during this conflict of the First World War. To what extent even a previously economically less significant region as Transylvania could be imagined as the springboard of European reconstruction after a German Austro-Hungarian victory. So offering a non-determinist account, I think, is one of the key findings, not just of this book, but in general, the NEPOSTRANS project, placing this region in a broader European context. Also, especially when we compare it to the post-World War II era, we need to take the collapse of empires seriously, and the chaos that it produced, and why that happened, and why, as Gábor said in the previous panel, it gave agency to local societies, and often why this agency of local societies, of national councils, of factories, of business elites, of local army units was the main answer of why there was no radical transition or no radical genocidal policy or expulsion in Southeast or East Central Europe, because the state had to be recreated from the bottom up. The state had to be recreated through these local networks that often bred pragmatic ties, that often went often contradicted the nationalist rhetoric otherwise wielded by successor states. Also, one of the points that we could discuss is to what extent post-imperial transition emerges as a new era in historiography, wedged between 1914 and 1918 and the interwar period, this period after 1918. And I think, you know, the panels here in this conference definitely speak to the importance of this era of transition. One other interesting thing for me listening to other panels in this conference is to what extent the Paris Peace Conference or the League of Nations is missing from our discussions. And it's definitely missing to some extent from my book, in part because the major actions of the League don't materialize until the mid-1920s, and the Paris Peace Conference often just approves processes that take place on the ground, which is another argument for looking at local societies. One question is, where should we move forward from this? I mean, there is such a proliferation of studies. How can we progress from here? Do we need more case studies of more regions, of more cities? Or has the time come for a synthesizing work of let's say, this era of post-imperial transitions? What would be the benefit of new case studies, if any, and what should they be focusing on? Just in closing, connecting it to other panels, to Matthias Morris's quantitative economic history. Often we talk about contradictions and different methodologies and between quantitative and qualitative histories. But I think one of the connecting points between this project, this book project, and quantitative economic history is that, as we could see yesterday, there is no difference or no, in 1918 does not constitute a major break. If we look at the numbers of economic output of these regions, Keynes, with whom this book is highly critical of, his vision that East Central Europe is going to decline economically just did not materialize. And my book investigates sort of why and what could be the answers for that. So the collapse of Austria-Hungary does not produce an economic collapse of the region. In part, my answer is because of these pragmatic deals between businesses and business elites. And this also, one final thought brings me to conclude that nationalism is an inadequate tool to look at economic life, to look at business life. In general, ideology may be an inadequate tool to look at economics and business life. As for the investigation of this era, my answer was a micro-historical answer that may not be generalized for history or the history of 20th century Europe as a whole, but I think it's a very useful tool for the era of post-imperial transitions. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, I hope it's working. Yes, I think binary options of focusing on the East and West seem to be a little bit outdated and reductionist in explaining European history. And I would have loved to talk about, as all of you, of my new book, which is on the end of Ottoman rule in Bosnia. It's not on the beginning of Habsburg rule. Most of the books are on the beginning of Habsburg rule and how the Habsburgs somehow started off. I think my book is one of those very few who deal how it came to an end and not how it started. but I won't do this. I take it serious, the task that we were given by Gabor and also conveyed to us by Lucija is to really take it serious and reflect about, is there still a need to, I mean, we know Cold War past has divided Europe into two pasts, not just in imagination, but in reality, and somehow produced a kind of adequate or a history that somehow corresponded with this. Now we are beyond it. So is the West-East story to put aside? I will address this by talking about four topics on West-East or East-West. The first one is historical legacies in the historiography on European integration. First one. The second one is a project that we had for a long time, West-East and the issue of phantom borders. The third one is West-East in the post-World War II revolutions, counter-revolutions after the First World War. And finally, West-East in the local approach to the post-World War transitions that are in the NEPOSTRANS topic, so in the focus. So is the West-Ost of relevance? I'll start with point one, historical legacies in European integration history. We are in the midst of formulating a graduate colleague, which in Germany is, if we get it, it will be a 10 years project with involving a lot of stuff, and it will be in historical legacies. So historical legacies that involve European integration past, but also somehow might be a factor in this kind of understanding the European integration project differently, for example, in the Western countries or in Eastern countries. Maybe just because time is limited, when the Coal and Steel Union was established, the 6 foundation members were struggling, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, they were in the middle of decolonization wars. And tried to somehow cope with this, and this entry into the European integration project was somehow a side effect of this integration past. So one could say the historical legacy also from other countries, Portugal, Spain, and also has a lot to do with decolonization. If you look to the other half of the European members of the European Union currently, most of those have something like the legacy of being part of the socialist realm, having a socialist past, and the entry into the European history integration has a lot to do also with this kind of coming to terms with this legacy of having been a socialist country, more or less dominated by the Soviet Union and so on. So one could say that are different legacies. One, you would ask in Germany and in Italy and others, is this kind coming to terms with the Nazi and fascist past? And I think Tony Judd has wonderfully explained in his post-war book that all European countries are struggling with this Nazi-fascist past to a certain degree, not somehow making hierarchies of it. Okay, historical legacies. Does this matter for the topic we discussed, East and West, and for looking to this particular historiographical interest to the pre-World or this kind of pre- and post-World War I decades that seem to be so of interest in historiographies, Southeastern, East Central, and so on, and one could say they are of less interest in Western Europe. So I would like to make this entry into my second point. The second point is West-East and phantom borders. We had a project in Berlin. I've been one of the members, and this is a concept that I think it was interesting. It had somehow was received quite very much in discussions, often with very different understandings what it meant. So for these reasons, I will read a kind of a division, what phantoms borders might be. In the Slavic video, we have written an article on this. Phantoms border we might understand earlier mostly political demarcations or territorial divisions that structure space despite their subsequent institutional abolishment. In many cases, historical spaces or their fragmentation continue to have an effect or even occasionally re-emerge. Definition. So, I mean, if you look to the weather forecast, yesterday I was looking, the sun is shining, and the Hungarian one, you see the sun is shining not just in Hungary, but also in the regions all around it. And if you look closer, it's one could see the former kingdom. But the same is the case if you look to the weather forecast in Austria. You always see the weather is fine in southern Tyrol. It's always part of the weather forecast, and probably many other countries have similar weather forecast. So it disappeared, but it not really disappeared and reappears. What does it mean for the West-East considerations? And I think the political map in Eastern, Central, and Southeastern area have been by far more flexible than in Western Europe. Let's look at the post-1989 decades. Here, Europe's East seemed to be indeed quite remarkable. In the recent decades, I think no other region in the world has witnessed the establishment of so many new or old states: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Kosovo. 14 new states re-established in a kind of historical borders. What are the historical borders, and how should appropriate borders look like? And here, this kind of phantom borders concept was interesting to play with it. These borders did not somehow metaphysically come to the earth, but were part of a political, sometimes social, cultural processes that somehow play with kinds of nostalgic imaginations, often not unknown to larger parts of the society. And one could mention them as a kind of historical legacies that exist. And I think the outcome of all of this is not deterministic. There are many outcomes possible. But the reference point to this showed that, in particular, due to the situation, there is a different situation in phantom border studies in East, Central, Eastern Europe than there is in the West. So that's my second point. The third point is the West-East issue in the post-World War I revolutions. And I think it was very important to put 1917 and its aftermath in the global perspective. As, for example, one of the books, Stefan Rinke, Michael Wild, Revolutions and Counter-Revolutions after 1917. And we can see that post-1917 revolution has been, can also be seen differently if we put them into the global context. But back to the West-East story. I think it's not totally wrong to see a different dynamic with regard to the issues of post-19 revolutions in the European East. Máté mentioned the decision makers at the peace negotiation table were making decisions, mostly on the spaces in East Central Europe, and in this regions went to a turbulent process of border demarcations, which was accompanied by a lively development of revolutions. I mean, the East and the Bolshevik revolutions, first of all. Hungary, there was a short revolutionary episode. Other revolutionary seemed likely to happen, more likely than in many parts of Western Europe. And this is interesting in a book project that I will refer to later. Is we've seen how these Bolshevik revolutions were somehow running counter to what the decision maker expected to be implemented. It should be a liberal capitalist democratic East. It should not be a Bolshevik one. It should be like the Western one on self-determination, as in Wilson's understanding, first of all, as democratic states, somehow referring to the of the people. Here again, it's not the possibility to go into details, but here as well, it might be not totally wrong to reflect on different ways of how the story of the interwar period might have produced different dynamics, and on the long term, also contributing to this mentioned historical legacies. I come to my final and fourth point, and this is now somehow related to a book project. So the local approach to the post-World War I transition. I had the opportunity to finishing it with a group of colleagues. Gabor was also part of the authors about the making of the Austro-Hungarian border between 1918 and 1922-23. It will appear hopefully with Berkan next year. So does the West-East topic play a major role in this book that is very much focused on, as the introduction states, local regional polarizations during times of geopolitical realignments? So we took a kind of a borderland perspective by closely looking on the factual implementation of a new state border, and where I think it became possible to receive a not so bad understanding about how the new, presumably national societies were imagined, argued for, and how they were legitimated, for instance, through arguments of history or geography. And this is certainly everything true for the post-imperial cases of Austria and Hungary. The focus was, as it is in NEPOSTRANS, the local situation and the striving of local inhabitants, at least the vast majority of them was dramatically focused on their economic survival. So is it helpful to reflect on the issue of the local in historical research and post-World War transition to the East-West story? The answers of historians are most often, others have done it the same, yes and no. No, if you look, the returning soldiers came back into misery, trying to start a life again. Many perished in the war, returned physically, mentally damaged. The security situation, food supply crisis, and so on. Does it really change? But I think where the East is different to the West is the local stories of struggling for survival after the experience of the Great War did have a different character in the East, because it took place in the period of the establishment of new state borders, new state project, also in the atmosphere where the revolutionary option was much more likely than in the other one. And in this way, also the local history might be seen in different lights. So as mentioned at the beginning, the East-West approach was something that I did not come up with as my topic for presentation, but was invited to talk about. I tried to address it by having these 4 points, and this is the background also for my input, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I would, before moving on to Paul, I would just like to say everyone kept perfectly in time. So Paul and Adam, if you want to make it longer than 10 minutes, you are welcome. A few more minutes, more than that. Yeah. So go ahead, Paul.
Lucia, people are still hungry, so okay. So I'd like to start with two points. The first is that during our discussions, Russia was in and out when related to the East, and the second thing is that in our panel, the labeling of our panel, Central disappeared. So we found ourselves in a strange situation. We'll try to cope with that. The space limits being blurred we were here supposed not to focus only on the post-World War I time, as you could see. And here we are confronted with a very specific situation, which is not connected to our work, but to the fact that the major works that were distributed and read on our region were the books of Tim Snyder. And the time period encompassed by Snyder leaves out the First World War. So we're in a situation where there is some type of retro-projection of space ideas, which is very strong, even in the historical corporation, not to speak without it. Second thing, we are subject to the various state policies which are writing exclusively on nation states. The example of the Second World War Museum in Gdansk is amazing. They transformed a World War II museum in the Museum of the Great Patriotic War of Poland, of Russia, but exactly the same concept. The war starts with us, ends with us, and it's about us. And we saved the world. And we suffered the most. So this is the context also for us. And so to face the various questions we had to answer, recent trends. The actors that were studied are more diverse. We are meeting with local issues that were totally disappearing. But the questions are not so many. I must say I was surprised that brutalization was totally out of scope. And talking about post-World War issues, I found it interesting. What came up much more strongly in the last 30 years was that in the balance in between inertia and change, inertia came up. But that's all. So it's not so important. If we think about publication projects during these last 2 or 3 decades, what strikes me is that the anniversary commemorations for the First World War were amazingly still state-centered, and we could see that when we look at the way nothing was very much connected with the anniversary of the Soviet Revolution and the other revolutions. So 2 different trends was very limited interaction. And that's quite puzzling, I think. If we look at the internal Central European level, then the victory-defeat paradigm is still very strong. Whereas, as your maps did show, the situation is very simple. On the East, the Germans won, they lost on the West. So we are in the 1918 November victory is a victory where Germans are asked to keep the order on the East. And as you know, in Hungary, the poor French soldiers here, they just expected Czechoslovaks or Romanians or Serbs to do something. They were totally unable. The only thing they did was to allow Horthy to have a big political career. That's a big glory of France. Apparently, it's not very much accepted here, but that's the way it is. If we look at the way things go on a more global level, I have the feeling that we still didn't think through the way the end of the First World War, the Paris Peace Conference and everything was a major turning point for the expansion of the US vision, US and partially British vision, of what races, what ethnic groups are, what ethnic capacity is. And this, until today, has not been assessed, because what we see, even in books today, as a very typical volcanic thing or whatever, has been very much informed by the vision of the great powers and mostly the influence of the US and also French visions, but not so clearly. This is impressive, and the habilitation of Isabelle d'Avion writes on that, not as much as I would have liked to, but it's starting. So here we have a real transnational perspective, but not used so much. Now, third point. New things. The first thing is that the timeline we are using, as we could see today, is hopefully changing. So the isolation of one episode is getting, we need it for our careers, we need to write books about an object. Okay, good. But apparently, if the exchanges go on, it will be possible to avoid the over-focusing on the moment and on one type of time, that is long-term, short-term, immediate. And I think that the interconnection of these levels is one of the big stakes we are confronted to. I won't mention the incredible impact of the corporative matters. As you saw all the panels that we had before ours, they are corresponding to positions in universities. We are defined gender studies, et cetera, et cetera. So we are very much under the sociological pressure of our own corporation. That's another question. I wanted to underline the very strong commitment of military institution in paying for history, which has also an impact, you can say, here and in other countries. And last but not least, I think that one of the things that is changing is that we are taking into consideration the Turkish and the Turkish-Greek relationship, so that ethnic engineering gets more momentum, but not as much as it should, because that's a long-term thing, and it's going on now. And you see it now in Bosnia-Herzegovina with what happens in Bosnia and the Dayton Agreement, which is exactly just a second version of what happened in Paris in 1919, 1920. It's really interesting. So here we have an interesting thing. And one of the things we could think of as opening new venues, new possibilities. First, one of our main problem is languages. So artificial intelligence could maybe help to work on other corpuses when you don't master 25 languages. It could also help to not to be dependent on precise archival resources, but be able to sample out on a much wider basis. And this is one of the major challenges of the next 10, 20 years, because then it would help us to work differently, not only for the region, of course. I would also think that one of the topics that could be of use would be the end of violence. How do we get out of violent situations? Would this be private or public, common or not? This is one of the major questions in our region, because that's one of the differences. The private violence was not the same east and west in the majority of places. And that's one of the questions. So medicine and psychology could be partners much more than they are now. And here, the question, and the one which is the more difficult, and I get back to what Raoul said yesterday, identity-driven narratives are the basis of the money, the curricula, and the positions, mostly. How can we go beyond these political expectations? And here we get to the last point. I would say just a couple of things. Is our corporation able to answer the Cambridge Analytica paradigm, which is now you have an intellectual entrepreneurship which is able to target very small groups according to their own opinions, the way they buy things, and speak to them in different languages. And we are in a very difficult position. And this is what we are confronted to. Another question is, how far is the academic world wishing to encompass the democratic perspective and commitment? Because for obvious reasons, it's interrelated. I won't get back to the Ukraine matter, but that's directly one of the questions. And I would like to end with two ideas. The first is that, strangely enough, domination as a word wasn't used in the last 2 days. And domination is what is underlying a good part of our discussion. So my take on that is that that's why intersectional visions of things are a problem, because the underlying idea is that all people resisting one type of domination or another are going to merge together or should merge together. But as a historian, I never saw that. So it's like projecting a wish on history, on moral grounds. I'm not so sure it works. Then the major question I think NEPOSTRANS helps us to cope with is the question of behavior transmission. Because basically that's what it is about. We love discourses, we love money moving around. The question is, how do people behave? And what does it mean to be in power? To show you have power at your disposal. And here, the other word that I missed was fear. And why do I say that? I've been coming to this country since 1979. I met fear on an everyday basis until 88, 89. And today I meet it again. I have friends tell me, I can't say that under certain circumstances. So here we have a long-term history of fear. We have a real question. A good number of the Hungarian scholars that are here are no longer in the country. And do they say exactly the same thing, or would they say exactly the same things, being abroad and being here? That's a good question. And here I end my speech. Thank you so much for your attention.
So first of all, thank you, Gabor, and thank you, Lydia, for organizing this conference and inviting me. I must say that this is the first East European conference I ever participate, because some of you know I'm an Arabist, actually, and modern Middle East historian. So I very rarely, actually never participated in a European East conference, not to say an Eastern European East conference. So thank you so much for kind of taking me in. And what a great conference is this. I presume the number of ERC grants per square meter is like extremely high. So amazing. So thank you, Gabor, for inviting me here. Okay, so how can I change? Yeah. So just to, I presume I should talk a little bit about the Middle East as the East and the problem of post-imperial transition in a Middle Eastern example, and I will do so by my new book. So those of you who don't know what is this imagined region called the Middle East, here is a map of this imagined region. On one hand, you can see the Ottoman Empire in 1914, more or less. Egypt nominally is still part of it, under British occupation, and on the other side, you can see around 1922, after the war, the mandate system and the independent states, more or less. Usually in modern Middle Eastern history, there are three easy ways to tell the story. The first one is the nationalist one, just like in Eastern Europe, which is usually the story of Arab nationalism and how Arab nationalism creates nation states. The second one, and which are then suppressed by Europeans. The second one is the colonial story that actually the First World War is actually a story about European, finally, economic colonization and then Zionism in Palestine. And the third version, or the third framework of interpretation, is the post-colonial one, which, taking over the subaltern concept, say that the nation state itself was a tool of EU colonization, so in a way combining the two. Especially the national and the colonial narratives are actually the same sides of the two sides of the same coin, in a way that they kind of need each other in order to make sense. So my book that was just published 3 weeks ago by Princeton University Press, it offers a, if you want, to force alternative. And this book offers a framework of interpretation for state making in new imperial history, and I put a question mark there because I am also critical a little bit of new imperial history, but I have a more or less clear imagination what it should be or what it should mean. The book also contains microhistories of what I call constituent events, so moments, usually a year or 2 years, when the regime forms and the major constitutional imaginations are decided either in various levels, so through imperial, international, and local levels. And it is also a study of legal authority, so I use a lot of court records, how authority is changing as there are various regimes between the 1920s and the 1930s. But today I will just very quickly talk about the first one, and just one moment about my sources, because a book about Arab kingships or Arab kings in the interwar period is a very male-centric story. So I actually use some of my court records, especially the Syrian ones, to bring in some female voices, because the Sharia courts in Syria especially, but also in Egypt, let's say are used by 60% by female litigants in this period. So by using the court records from below, using microhistory, you can bring in this large political history, some small actors. Now, let's talk about this interpretative framework that I offer, and I would like to convince you, and very likely I will fail. So I propose that, and I don't agree with Máté, I think there is might be some unifying large narratives that we can say about this period. And one large narrative can be the story of what I call recycling empire, or spoliation of empire, or recasting empire. And behind this, there is an understanding of historical change, which is non-revolutionary, if you want, counter-revolutionary. Let's bring the Marx in me out. So most of the states in the Middle East and also in the post-Habsburg territories, which are created without revolutions or failed revolutions. So the question, in my opinion, is not indeed not nationalism, how nationalism produces states, or how egalitarian ideologies produce states, but how historical change, which is non-revolutionary, creates new states. And at the end, I give an answer to this. Instead of the nation state, I use the term local state. Gabor used local, Máté used local, I think Hannes used local. I elevate this category into an analytical term, and I talk about local states and local governments in which there are national projects. I think nationalism is still, of course, very, very important, but this gives a good grasp on thinking about other very important constituent fictions, not only the nation, but also the monarch or religion, for instance, as an important feature in state making. I also talk about successor societies, and with successor societies, I talk about successor diasporas. So imperial dissolution also produces, as we very well know, successor diasporas, and successor diasporas are very important then feeding back into state-making processes from abroad or from the distance. I also propose a concept as a separate, a very boring chapter about what I call governing without sovereignty as the major characteristic or nature of the League of Nations domination in this time in the, but that's perhaps also in the post-Habsburg territories, through the mandate system, through international law, and through military occupation. So I think the main characteristic feature of the early 1920s is really an emerging of a new legalistic understanding of how to govern regions without sovereignty, because the local states are supposed to be sovereign. So how empires can use sovereignty as a legal principle now within that toolbox, right? Or how can they govern without sovereignty, if you want? And the answer to the first question of how can we think about non-revolutionary historical change, non-revolutionary state-making, if you want, is, I borrowed this from actually South Asianists, imperial constitutionalism. Imperial constitutionalism from below and from above. So there are groups, local groups, who are also advocating certain concepts and certain constitutional imaginations. And of course, there are groups from above, both the local elite groups and the international or continuing imperial elites in France and Britain and in Italy and other allied power states, which are actually the victors of the war. And so imperial constitutionalism is a way to create states, in this case, sovereign states, through religious, dynastic, ethno-national, and federative ideas. So the polities which emerge after 1919, in my opinion, these local states are all somehow belonging to this large framework. My claim is that this framework is also valid for those post-Harbor territories, and not only for the Middle East, but of course my case studies are all from the Middle East, or especially from the Arab regions, and I look forward whether Europeans would accept or completely destroy me beat me after this little talk. Gábor asked for previous literature. Of course, my work, if you want, takes the 90s transitology that I think Monica mentioned once, and tries to make it to work together with new imperial history, also bringing in other, if you want, analytical post-colonial theory from, for instance, from African states and so on and so forth. I'm not going through the authors, as most of you know, most of the authors. If not, then this is the theoretical background of my work. Another slide, also Gábor asks for literature on post-Ottoman studies. It is admittedly a US-centric list. Perhaps the most important one, actually the first person who started is not in the US, Erich Zürcher, who in the late 80s proposed this idea that instead of seeing the Ottoman Empire and then the Republic in Turkey after 1922, 1924, we should actually look at the 1908 and the 1950 period as one. Because in all this period, the so-called Young Turks dominated the government, be that the Ottoman imperial government or the Republican government. And this framework actually works very well in some cases, also in the Arab cases. For my own work, Michael Provence's 2017 book, The Last Ottoman Generation, was a great inspiration, and we are cooperating in many other ways because he proposed this idea that, okay, everybody in the 1920s and 1930s, of course, was educated in the Ottoman system. Many of the Arab politicians in the 1920s, 1930s, just like here, were coming out of Istanbul schools or the imperial metropole schools. So let's think about this interval period as the last, the main actors as the last Ottoman generation. I presume the last Habsburg generation we can also think about in here, and so on and so forth. There is also a rethinking of the pre-1918 period or pre-1908 period in Ottoman studies, and I put some names here. Some of the works are not yet published. Janel's book is coming out perhaps soon. Roy Barsade is thinking about bringing in the idea of word making that I really hate into this post-imperial formation, and Camille Coe's work is also in the making on the Gulf monarchies, etc. Okay, so just for you or for this panel, I put together this just in my kitchen this morning, this alternative timeline. Paul asked for alternative timelines or alternative periodization. So one can think about the Middle East and Eastern Europe as parallels in the 20th century. And so one way to tell this parallel story is that until 1918, one can think about an inter-imperial history between the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, including the Bosnian question, of course, very much, switching empires and region switching empires. Then we can think about the military occupations, the moment of military occupations, actually the long First World War. And then we can think about the period of the local states, which all have sometimes very strong nationalizing projects, bringing in ethnic and increasingly racist ideas. And then after that, we have perhaps the age of nation states. ironically, in Eastern Europe, states are subordinated in this period, but in the Middle East, this is the age of independence and decolonization. So perhaps a new age of federalization. Just to conclude, my own next projects are focusing on administrative and fiscal law in the Middle East. I think administrative law and legal studies legal history is perhaps the most important field where I think perhaps even comparative studies between Eastern Europe and the Middle East should focus on. And finally, I myself recently became very interested in machines in the Middle East, so I will try to write partly a business history. So Maria, thank you for your talk yesterday on the late 19th, early 20th century Euro-Mediterranean industrialization, and that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you everyone for these great presentations and talks. So since this is the last panel of our conference, I thought that I wouldn't ask very specific questions in relation to your case studies, as interesting as they might be, but rather to kind of push us all collectively to try to abstract a bit from what you said. And the most interesting kind of common denominators among everything that you presented was reflecting on how we could actually use different timelines, how in some contexts the division between winners and losers of the First World War can become obsolete, how actually there are many similarities between empires and nation states, which I guess NEPOSTRANS is quite a bit about, and of course how East Central Europe as a lens itself, as a regional lens, helped us to move away from this Versailles-centered story of the First World War and to actually distinguish between the narratives of this transition and, I mean, I wouldn't like to say reality, but somehow to look at the things from below and to give agency to non-traditional actors or maybe non-traditional sources. And particularly what kind of, I guess, this whole ERC project and everybody who is in the orbit of such topics is focusing on is continuities, whether it is of imperial institutions or social hierarchies or elites and so on and so forth, versus the national projects, or as you also nicely said, local governments and so on. So in that sense, I wanted to ask everyone a question. If we take all these kind of theoretical contributions made by people reflecting on this and project it to the European history, so completely disregarding East, West, and any other directions, how would you imagine a synthetic meta-narrative that could be kind of a basis for a new collective memory around this period? I know it's a huge question, and I know everyone in there, what they sent me at least was kind of critical of, yes, we have new findings and we have a lot of work being done, but it doesn't always get, you know, kind of channeled into the collective memory. But if how would you say on a European level that these findings would, could be made synthesized and then channeled into a collective memory in the contemporary context? Yeah, you can go any order which you wish. If it's too big of a question, I'm sorry. Yeah.
For me, it's very easy, but this is, so first of all, I think in my own field, so modern Middle Eastern historians are separated completely almost from Eastern European historiography and current debates. And I think this is a huge problem, the real problem. So this is one problem. And the second, and I think vice versa. So for instance, of course, Middle Eastern historiography is much more advanced in terms of thinking about colonialism for colonialism. Actually, again, kind of getting rid of, I try to get rid of this whole thing because I think, so two fields should learn. And for the popular memory, this is what you asked for, the current memory. So this return of empire as an analytical form of organizing peoples, that we understand it now this way. So not only the Star Wars definition of empire, right? But we try to think about empire as a logic of organizing regions and territories and peoples. That, at least in my field, it has a huge comeback through the Ottoman Renaissance. And I think the self-perception of many, let's just talk about Arab historians today, or their narratives are changing due to this rediscovery of the Ottoman past. It is not the Turkish yoke necessarily that we have to discuss, but it was a living world, and this world, from this world we are coming from. We are not coming from an ideal Arab nation state from somewhere, but, and I don't know about the Habsburg cases, but I presume that might be the same, perhaps.
I mean, it's a question whether we need grand narratives anymore, but I think what we haven't really given much justice to is to what extent this entire project, or what we are all doing, especially NEPOSTRANS, at least how I see it, or how I see even my book, is a counter-history. It's a counter-narrative to the national histories that, let's give it to them, they are extremely persuasive. And if we look at to what extent what we are all doing seeped into current politics or popular discussions, we can conclude that it's an absolute failure of what we are all doing. Look at the Trianon Memorial. It offers an extremely persuasive narrative, collapse of historical Hungary that breeds into national tragedy. Or in the Romanian case, the unification of the great unification of all the Romanian territories created modern Romania. That was very much at the center of Romanian discussions of the centenary. So I was wondering, listening to Ádám, to what extent what you're doing is building on or countering some sort of established narrative of these Middle Eastern states and their various national histories. And in a way, that's a limitation also of what we are trying to do. To what extent we are trying to should we squander our energies taking down these big narratives? Should we establish a new grand narrative that will come with its own omissions, right? I mean, to what extent are we playing down the force of nationalism? To what extent my book is playing down the force of nationalism? So I just wanted to give justice to the fact that the limits and potentials of revisionism and where we are going to do. And I think it's a good question to what extent the synthetic work is needed and how it would look like. But I think modesty is probably a good reference point here. What I try to do is to present case studies, and I like your formulation, Ádám, of constituent events, or Grandi, the microhistorian, has another term for events that sort of enlighten structures, but I think we also need to establish their limitations and to what extent and where they matter. Did all the business elites survive in all the successor states? Did all ethnic minorities thrive? No, they didn't. It depended on where they were located. In the Hungarian-Romanian border, it wasn't that advantageous to be in a border city like Arad or Timișoara. It was much better to be in Cluj or Kolozsvár. So there are limits, I think, to these synthetic narratives, and modesty is a good reference point.
I also skeptical about the big synthesis because, no, but I think that, and we started yesterday already discussing about should we have an optimist or pessimist approach to history as a history professionals. There are arguments why we could be pessimistic, but I think, I mean, and Jan's presentation has shown with the Polish case that the whole stories are not working. if they are somehow scrutinized by historiography, they don't stand the test of scientific historiography. What does this mean in effect then for what's happening in political life? I don't know, but I think that if this is achieved by the historiographical profession, a lot is achieved. So the historiographical sanctus, maybe it's given by some, but not generally, I think, by in a broader field of international historiography, one does not buy the story. And I think political populism has to live with it. Maybe it can live with it or not, we will see it. But I think the task and the intervention power that we have, I don't know, this veto recht der Quelle or something like this, what we always learned, is a powerful tool. I mean, we should not, I think we should be optimistic in it. But let's see who is right.
So if I well understood, the question was not who is right. Okay, so, and the idea is that maybe a grand narrative couldn't be an answer to your question. But I could say that what is striking is that during the last 20, 30 years, the victimizing aspect of national tales went up very strongly. And that's quite fascinating. Therefore, one of the possible answers, at least, is to study empowerment where it happens. And that's what many of us did in various contexts. But it was not connected to each other as empowerment. So here we were speaking mostly of domination, but the partially liberating aspects of history didn't always pop up because of political defeats and whatever, but maybe we could think about that. And the other, if there is a common feature, I felt even when listening to Adam's project, I'm quite fascinated by the works by Julia Bavouzer in Vienna. And I find that the history of the techniques of government, even the machines, the papers, the forms that are used, the legal settings for building up the administrations wherever. Could be in Kabul, it could be here. This is something very much common, and this connects to empowerment or the lack of empowerment. And in our societies today, the vast majority of people feels disempowered with administration, rulings that are totally not understandable by anyone normal because you cannot swallow them. And I think that this history of what is swallowable, how, and how you make it unswallowable to citizens, this is a way in which we could reassess a lot of things and be heard. So that's another question.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I guess we can open a floor for questions. Yeah, go ahead, Maria. Maybe microphone first. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. First, Maria, then. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you all for your presentations. I have a question to Máté and one to Ádám. The question to Máté is about this very pragmatic approach, because I find your research approach highlighting local agency very interesting. And I would like to ask you to elaborate on the role of business elites and transnational business connections in coming up with this very pragmatic approach that the local actors then used in Transylvania to come to terms with the new borders. So how business interests had an influence on the future of industries and sub-regions and helped to realize the coexistence of various ethnicities, probably. And the question to Ádám relates to women, much as I like to talk about business history, but women is another fascinating topic. So I am very curious about how do you weave the women's perspective into your story and into your analytical concept, even taking into account that the sources you use to discover this female approach is probably biased because the women may have or must have used the framework and concepts that were dominant at the time to have any kind of success at the Sharia. Thank you both.
We have Raúl, László, and then Matthias.
Thank you all for your contributions. My question is to all of you and follows up a bit on Lucia's. What I'm getting at is not so much a grand narrative, but the question of memory that she raised, which I think is very important. So, and then Máté's response kind of confirmed my feeling that this is important, because you're talking counter histories and you're talking, answering back to the nationalist reading of history. But I think what we're bothered about, and the two examples you used, Trianon and the Romanian 1918 celebrations, are not history but memory. So the issues here seem to be more about the traces of those, what I think Hanno very usefully called legacies, and what I also call legacies in my work. So to what extent do you all think that these histories that we're engaged in should take more seriously the notion of producing counter legacies, not necessarily counter histories, but to follow those traces? And again, I know I might have been going on too much about education, but I think this is one point where we can connect to education, where this disempowerment that Paul was mentioning is less felt when the legacy is local, when it's personal, when it's a micro history, a family history. That's, in my view, at least from engagement with students, a path to empowerment, a path to history not happening to you, coming from the state, whatever, regardless whether that state is a nation state or an empire, or whatever the hell it is, but something that you're part of might make the legacy more meaningful. It might be a way to fight back against these, again, not histories, but legacies we don't like.
Thank you, Szabolcs László. I very much like Máté's point about Transylvania being the center. I'm also from Transylvania, so I like this argument. But the question is, so how do we relate these potential moments of microhistory where something considered peripheral becomes a center for a while, but maybe in the long term it's still the periphery? So how does that, or should we throw away the whole analytical framework of periphery center when we think about these things? Yeah, that's all.
Matthias?
Yes, so thank you very much. So I don't want to be the spoiler of the party, but sometimes that falls to economists who represent the dismal science as it became known. So for me, the question of the panel was a kind of to ask whether East and West remain important categories in historical research. And I think as none of you has really come out with a clear-cut yes to that question, perhaps let me make this case. So if we want it or not, the differences remain very big between Eastern and Western Europe, and that also has an impact on how we conduct research. I mean, as I tried to explain yesterday, the differences, the economic difference between Western and Eastern Europe, they do not go back to state socialism. They go back to 1800, and from earlier research which we have, they probably go even further back in time. In fact, that's currently one of the projects I'm trying to set up to see how far back they go. Now, you might say these are only numbers that matter in the heads of economists. I would disagree, because they actually determine the real world experience of people. But what is very important to see is that these numbers, they also translate into a political history that has been very different. So we all remember Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, which was the first interstate conflict after World War II in Europe. Now, let me continue in that vein. There are two really failed transitions after 1989. By failed, I mean countries that actually produce less in 2008, which is a good benchmark here, financial crisis, which produce less in 2008 than in 1990. These two countries are Moldova and guess what? Ukraine. So Ukraine becomes easy prey partly because of a failed economic transition. So that doesn't justify what Russia does. Of course it doesn't, but it is a way of indicating that very serious economic problems in some of these countries have very substantial economic repercussions. So kind of this project indirectly here or directly, and we as we sit here in this environment, is sponsored by the European Union. And it seems to me we have to face up to the reality that if we want to make Europe work, we have to make Eastern Europe work. And that also involves actually acknowledging that the differences economically, politically, remain very big to this day.
Holly? Yeah, Holly is in the back.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this panel. Lots of interesting stuff. My question is about future historians, given what historians are like today. So given that historians tend to look into the past for the subtleties and nuances that you've drawn out of this period, in light of Máté's comment, I can kind of imagine a future historian looking back on this period in Hungarian history and saying, well, it was actually quite complex. There was lots of resistance, and it was, you know, like you can imagine a narrative that sort of like makes some element of experience like feel completely or that delegitimates some element of experience. And I wonder if we can know when we're doing this to the past, and whether, you know, like whether there's something in what you describe that is precisely attuned to this problem, and whether the way that we write the history of the past has some different kind of bearing on how we relate to the present, as, you know, like imagined subjects of the work of future histories, if you will.
Maybe that's it for now in terms of questions. We are already a bit over time, and I'm sure everyone is hungry. So let's have answers in maybe in this order, or yeah. Okay, Hannes.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I don't believe in the bright future of nationalist historiography. I don't think that it's an outdated way of writing history, and I don't think that it will be a kind of a success story for the future historians. And you said the historical memory. I mean, I'm coming from Austria. Until the 1980s, Austria was regarded as the first victim of the German Reich, and not somehow. And then there was really a break that where also what has been discussed in historiography then also became part of the public sphere. And I don't think that that nationalist historiography in Austria has a big chances now for going into. So that doesn't mean that it is not existing. Yeah. So it's a plural field, and probably sometimes, and I think that studying nationalism still makes sense. could maybe over lunch. I think the East-West differences, and this was the purpose that we were asked to discuss about. I mean, not necessarily wanting to, but then we entered into, and maybe it's fruitful to go into this. I think it's difficult to write a common European history because there is no common European experience. Europe is globally entangled differently from in different parts of Europe. So European history looks differently if you write it as a Portuguese historian or as a Bosnian historian, and also internally different. But this is the way Europe existed for a long period of time. And the economic argument, I'm not so sure. I'm more convinced with what you said at the beginning, that there are regional hubs throughout Europe that boom and others less. Yeah, and maybe in this kind of regionalization and localization of historiography of Europe, we are on the better path than to create macro regions. I think the macro regions are dead. I think this, I believe.
Okay. So, as the question of legacies is concerned, some of us maybe remember good old times when there was a counter-narrative to the nationalist win, which was the workers' movement narrative. And I doubt that just working as a counter something can be very efficient, because when you start like this, basically you start from the position you don't want to be the basis for your thoughts. So I would suggest not to try to have a counter narrative anyway. As far as legacies are concerned, the word counter is not the same. In fact, what happens always is that you have multiple legacies and one takes over. So the idea is more to look at alternative legacies just for them to swallow up the others. And here there would be many possibilities, but we don't have time to go on that. And as far as the East-West divide because of economics, so I don't know what you do about Slovenia. I don't know how you deal with Austria if you look at the regional level, because it's quite intricate. I do agree with Hannes that the Meso region, that is the intermediate twins, could be of use. And there is a point, because inside the European Union, budget is the main question. So we have to take into account that there is a normal bias. Nevertheless, when writing history, I'm quite fascinated by the fact that if you look at what Scandinavia looked like, or what southern Spain or southern Portugal looked like 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was not so different. Well, look at Sicily today. It's officially Western Europe. Go to Sardinia and Sicily. It's Eastern Europe if you consider, okay, maybe criminals are better developed there than elsewhere, but anywhere else in the world. They're top. So maybe this shouldn't be, the criminal business shouldn't be the ground of our thoughts. So I'm not so sure about that point. And the way historians will tomorrow live in the past through their own experience, because that's basically the idea you have will be exactly the same as today. The problem with historians is that we have to take some time because we have to go through materials and everything. So one of the question is, maybe my answer could be different if the methodology of our work can change in a substantial way, because accessing the ground information could be different. And today, we don't have any idea whether it's really possible or not. We are naturally conservative because we grow on what we did when we were in our 20s, 30s, 40s in relationship with historical material. But is that the reference? Oh, shall it be the reference? I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of questions, so I try to be quick and probably not give justice to all of them. Holly, you raised a very perplexing point going backward. Whether all that will remain, let's say, a reader in 50 years is subtleties and nuances. I'm wondering to what extent unity can be created on the level of the narrative, if not on the level of the argument, or even if we acknowledge still the forces of other types of arguments, let's say the nationalist arguments. That said, I still hope that, let's say in my book, I try to create some sort of a unity on an argumentative level as well. But let's say the stories we tell, or going back to Paul's point, instead of sort of fighting these narratives, but my doctoral advisor always discouraged me to do that. His holy case. We just tell our story. To what extent that's an answer, but it's sort of a longer conversation. I think what we can agree on in terms of quantitative economic history is that economics does not go hand in hand with politics. And in terms of my actors, or in the 19 teens, I don't see much usefulness for the East-West category, at least as it was later on came to be instituted by the Iron Curtain or the Cold War. And there are many other visions, geopolitical visions. I think Gergely Romšič is just writing a book about imperial visions, how all this geographical division of Europe looked very different from the perspective of 1917. So that's one way of looking at it. Szabolcs László, I appreciate the point. Yes, it's true that, let's say, microhistory should not form or produce its own teleology or its own sort of determinism and the heroic or romanticized view of local actors and regions that we now know have not become the cornerstones of European economic development, such as Transylvania. But I was wondering to what extent we can still sort of use these terms in a context-specific way and not go top-down, let's say using center, periphery, semi-periphery, as it's very much in vogue in critical, very good critical histories and sociologies of the region. Memory and counter-narrative, Raoul's point. I'm very skeptical, but I also think it's a very interesting point that we can sit here in Hungary and Budapest now and essentially offer very different narratives that may be in vogue politically and nobody really cares. And also in terms of AI, it was also one of the prompts to think about what AI can do to this history. I'm actually quite skeptical. I don't think that the only use would be to access more databases, but sort of a cherry-picked history that can very much recycle and take bits and pieces from what we do and interpret it in its own ways. In terms of also, it was interesting for me to see now that the Hungarian translation of my book is out that there are conservative, right-wing, but also left-wing and liberal readings of the same book and of the same argument. And I think AI would be much better at these slanted readings. And we can discuss this more, Maria's more specific questions. But going back to the point on to what extent this is a counter narrative, if the first narrative is the working class centered narrative, I do think that what has been forgotten is the force, at least situationally in 1917, 1919, early 1920s, of the working class movement and workers per se. Let's say in the case of East Central Europe, or in the case of, let's say, Transylvania, one of the ties, one of the reasons why ties between Romanian and Hungarian business elites was possible was a joint fear of the working class movement that stops industrial production and the movement of armies in 1918 and 1919. So probably we need to take a new look at labor history. That definitely my book. It's one of the big omissions I did not do, but that's one of the new areas of research that could be very fruitful.
Yeah, I think everybody is very hungry. So am I right? So just very quickly, what should I say? What was the question?
Is there a counter narrative?
Yeah. So let's bring. I do believe. I sincerely believe that rethinking the 20th century in the light of the analytical consequences of new imperial history will produce a real change in how people think about their past and the 20th century, especially by bringing in, for instance, the role of religion throughout the 20th century, which is and will be a major question in the European Union, with migration and living together and so on and so forth. So I do think that that thinking about the interwar period and in larger terms, if we consequently apply the terminology or some of the consequences of new imperial theory, then it will really change and it will go deep. I don't think that our task is necessary. So some of your questions framed as if we would kind of fight with the state. So historians fight with the state over the people, right? That was kind of the, you asked Holly this kind of like what will be the future subjects of the historical or also history education. It's a misinterpretation. Sorry, but I did hear some references, perhaps not from perhaps Raúl or others. So I perhaps there is, and Máté also said that how my project challenges the Arab national historiography and so on and so forth, which is mostly state historiography. And yes, that's true, but I don't think that that's the level where I mean we should go, and it's but it's possible. So I do think that rethinking the 20th century is in a sense what Gábor's project is starting to do, and rethinking the 20th century starting in 1919 or 1920 is a great starting point. I think exactly this is, you asked why it is so important. Why is your book so important? Why? Because exactly this is the right, you chose the right period. This is where everything starts in a way. It's perhaps more important than the Second World War. Perhaps, I would even say. So I do think that that this is an issue. Now, East and West, very quickly, the question is for whom? So if you want to use East and West to convince a political decision maker that economic differences are still existing and has existed in the last 200 years, yes, it's important to use East and West. But if you want to argue, I don't know, that Eastern Europeans or Middle Easterns are leading autocratic governments because they are not able to reach the Western democracies, then don't use it, because it's not. So I mean, this is a very practical question. just to Maria at the end. So in the 1910s, there were actually civil courts, the Nizamiya courts, also in the Ottoman Empire. The Sharia courts were for several things, but family law. And the fact that I bring in female voices does not have an analytical content, so it does not, in the argument, it does not appear necessarily. It's mostly cosmetics, and mostly because I was so bored of the male voices that I just needed some. And I was very interested how they frame themselves in the court, whose subjects they are. And that was very interesting, actually, whose justice they wanted. When the Ottoman Caliph was still there, but for instance, Damascus was under Allied and then French occupation. So this is anyway. So that's it. Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause to our panel.